Well, ho again. Thanks for coming to the second episode. We can call these episodes, right, Brian?
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds good. Second episode of the first season, S1 E2, of our series, Building a Path to Production. And in this episode, what we want to talk about is I think, the relationship between an organization's strategy and their software capabilities. I like to throw around this idea of software as strategy or strategy as software, something like that. But what we want to go over is when you in your organization are doing software in a particular way, in the best way, as we'll get into. I think, having worked in strategy for a couple of years myself, about as long as I could stand that fire hose of knowledge and effort. Um, I think there's a lot that doing your software in the method that we've been doing it at Pivotal Labs and now at Tanzu Labs and Pivotal and Tanzu as a whole at VMware. There's a lot you can do if you understand how that software is done, if you understand the feedback and the learning that comes with that. And I think you can directly hook it up into your kind of corporate strategy function and vice versa. There's a lot that your corporate strategy function in your organization can do to fit better with how software is done, and to make the not only the software turn out better, but to really like make your business more lively and better. And also, just as one last thing, I'm sure throughout this we'll be talking about businesses and revenue and things like that, which is just kind of the easiest thing. There's all sorts of organizations that are not profit oriented, be they militaries or governments or other non-profit seeking organizations, and these same things apply. You just have to change the goals around to be more mission oriented about what those organizations want to do rather than profit oriented, so to speak. Well, first of all, I always like to start with I guess you could call them stories or dessert, but with an idea of what the end result looks like to kind of illustrate and give an anchoring to things. So I'm going to very quickly give these examples, but here's three little stories that I think represent what it looks like when you very, in a good way, closely tie together strategy and how you do software in your organization. Now, the first one is from a customer of ours, Liberty Mutual. And what they wanted to do business wise, they're an insurance company and, you always want to make more revenue as an organization. And the way they wanted to do that was to expand into a new market. So they wanted to start selling motorcycle insurance in Australia, which I always joke seems like a terrible business idea as an insurance company, but maybe it's actually great. Kidding aside, so what they needed to do was build that business from the ground up, including the software to sell the insurance, but also to use internally by the agents who were selling it. And because they were doing kind of following the best practices of doing software at the time that Pivotal Labs helped them out with. They were following a very design driven, a very lean driven process where they could actually think of a feature in their software, deliver it in about a week. And then I think it was a week with them, but less than a month for sure. And then observe people using it to see if it not only improved the way that people were using the software, but improved the business. And in this case, they discovered some things about how that software should work and how they could change kind of the dynamics of the business. And one of them, for example, pardon the use of a filler word like dynamics, but sometimes you just got to say these things. I'll try to avoid saying synergies, except for right there. But for example, and this seems like a small software thing, but you can understand that and with these other examples, that the way software is normally done, the workflow of the software would be specified way ahead of time and the developers would just deliver this project of it. But they discovered that instead of gathering a person's demographics first, right, which you could even say that's the way that an insurance business might work, is you would kind of see where they live, their age, things like that to kind of judge giving them insurance or not. Instead, they found in the software by experimenting that having the motorcycle entered as the first thing actually sped up the process and led to more closures of closing of selling insurance. Now, speaking of closing, The other thing that they found is they found entirely different workflows than they had anticipated for the insurance agents, because they were focused on, and you'll see this when we talk about OGSM in a little bit, but one of the strategic drivers they had, the objectives, if you will, was to make signing up as quick as possible, as frictionless as possible, to deliver on this strategy of course, you want to grow your revenue, expand your market share. But the way that they thought they would do this was to make it as easy as possible to sign up for insurance, which you would assume is always the case, but not always. Now, the second example, and this one I think is kind of going up the stack a little bit of something that normally a strategy group, definitely a management consultant group that you might hire to outsource your strategy to. Whenever I was working on strategy, I always thought, like, you hired all of us smart people, and then you're going to go outsource it to these other people. Why not just have us do that? Like, just give us a little expense account, give us some time. We'll go interview people, figure this stuff out. But no, they just had us align things on slides and stuff like that, work on pivot tables. Anyways, so here, this is from a commercial kitchen organization we worked with as well. And they wanted to optimize, which is to say spend less money in their kitchen, what they were doing in kitchens. So big, gigantic kitchens that you outsource at a campus or a business building, where you go get lunch or I think as people say in Brian's neck of the woods, the canteen. And they also wanted to make sure they had good customer experience, which in this case was having consistent food. And to do both of that, the people in kind of like the central kitchen where they would make up recipes, they wanted to make sure that people in all these edge locations, and as I go through this, you can make analogies to how IT is done. But in these edge locations, they wanted to make sure they were following the same run books, which is to say cookbooks. So their idea was what we should do is digitize these paper 3-ring binders. It was in the States, so it's 3-ring binders, not these weird European 5-ring ones or whatever they are. But there's these 3-ring binders of paper recipe books that would be shipped out, I think, every week or two. And, it's almost like doing manual configuration instead of automating your configuration. So the strategic direction was put them on iPads, because there you go. However, because the team doing this software was following these best practices of almost bringing strategy and discovery down to the team, they discovered that instead the kitchen staff was spending a lot of time on the toil of measuring the temperature of mayonnaise and chicken. And all of this time they were spending was really stealing time from their ability to do those other things, optimize how they were doing things by following recipes, making sure that they were, making the food as much as possible. And so the team automated that process of measuring things, it freeing up time for them. And eventually they got to digitizing the cookbooks. But you can see that instead of just taking the suggestion from the kind of consultative group of strategy, here's how we're going to improve this business and achieve those goals of optimizing the business and having good customer experience, there was more of this collaboration with the development team who was actually discovering and observing and seeing what these people in the kitchen were doing. And then finally, there's an example from, pardon, despite my last name, pardon my French pronunciation, there's an example from Orange here, which is big telco company in France and other places around Europe, I believe. And one of their strategies, any service like this, like a telco or another company that sells those kind of utilities, one of the things that they're always battling against is customer churn, right? Is customers going to some other rival that they have because it's easy. And so they focus a lot on customer experience as a very competitive differentiation. And so the strategy there was we should have a really good mobile app for small business owners, right? And these might be small business owners who have like a little store, on a street corner, or have a tiny grocery store, a bodega, as some people would call it, in New York or other places, or maybe they're delivering food. And so, it was just like, make them a good app that's responsive and does all this stuff, and then they'll have an app instead of this website. So what this team did is they actually studied what problems the people in the stores had, the development team doing it, and they discovered two interesting things. One, if you have delivery drivers and other employees, you might pay for their phones, right? You might issue them phones. And in order to control costs and be able to predict costs, these small business owners wanted to be notified when there were overages in their data and voice, so they could maybe tell people to stop doing that instead of waiting 30 days to learn about it. But then they also learned that I forget if it was the number one, but one of the top most important things that these owners wanted to do was basically just know what their current bill was and if they had paid the bill or not. And so, again, think about the way software is normally done. It's kind of, you've got these great ideas from your strategy people, your product people, that get passed down to the developers, and they would just implement it. But these findings happen because the application team was experimenting and observing what was happening. And so with that payment thing, what they did, as you can see here, is they put the current bill, and if the bill had been paid, like right there, like right on the I don't think you say home screen in an app. So these are the kind of examples that if you're following what we're about to talk about, if you're doing software in this helpful way, and I think very importantly, if you have the way you think about and roll out, but then redo strategy in your organization, if you have it working alongside, I was going to use another word, Brian, aligned with how you do software, then you can start to get these advantages. And with these stories, like one of the other things I think we're trying to articulate is that you can start to look at software as like not only core to your business, but like the way your business is done, right? Like the software, it's a little strong to say the software is the business, but analogously, right? Like if you go to a big retail store, you don't necessarily say the building is the store, but like it's a very important component of it. I'm not sure that analogy works. I'm going to think about that and maybe come back to it. So first of all, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Cote. I spend a lot of time learning stories like the ones I just went over, studying how people are getting better at or not getting better at, and using the way their own software in their organization to run that organization better, like, and how they, how they make common sense common, which often it's very uncommon, how you roll out those changes and scale it up. And I write about a lot of that stuff in my newsletter, but if you want to find out more, there's a easy link to go into, and you can also see the attachments in the webinar here.
And hello, folks. I'm Brian Ross. I am an executive advisor for the Tanzu team, where my job is that really interesting part, helping customers understand where technology, people, and process all come together. So I've had a technology background, but I've also been involved in entrepreneurship, a little bit of consultancy that we're still kind of getting over, and bringing all those skills together to try and find a way to link technology back to this business value, this idea of how do we do things better in a way that helps our business make more money.
Exactly. And if you remember episode 1, Brian always has lots of pragmatic, as they say, real world comments to say and add to things, which is super helpful. So I think there's two things we want to look at, and then we'll kind of go over some frameworks for how you can start actually doing strategy in a helpful way. And the two things that I think are good to look at are, so what does a good strategy look like when you are this closely tied to software, when you're doing software as strategy or strategy as software? I guess it's both SaaS, so you can place it however you want. And I think, and then we'll get into going over, like, if you don't quite know how software is done, I think it's really important to have kind of like an idea of how software is done and thought about, like how what kind of like software done best looks like. So first of all, I find, again, having worked in strategy for a couple of years and seen a lot over the years as an analyst and consultant, and working in large organizations where I have been both subjected to and the beneficiary of many types of strategies, I find that a strategy that is phrased like this one, that gives you a sense of like, what should I actually do, or like, what is a framework I can use to make decisions, right? Like that's you want a strategy. I mean, it's asking a lot, but that's why people who get paid strategy get paid the big bucks, as people like to say. You want something that's both concise, but that is not vague and kind of hints at what you want to achieve. Now, there's all sorts of orthodox definitions of strategy, and so at this point, if you're a big strategy wonk, you'll be like, that's not strategy. You got to consider the five forces and the color of your ocean water and all of these kinds of things. But that's great. We should have a whole another talk about that at some point in the future that I'm not involved in. But this one, if you see what it's communicating, and this is especially apt to people who are sculpting the business like a software developer would, is it's making the point that like this is from DBS Bank in Singapore, which multiple times has won awards for being like the best digital bank, and they've achieved business objectives based on being a digital bank like this over the years. But you can see what they're driving at is that our goal is to make banking for our customers as quick and frictionless and stress-free of a thing as possible. Like, and you can see how they removed all those kind of business words and just made it into a snappy phrase. So what that means to me is like, for example, depending on what country I'm living in, if I need to pay a bill or transfer money, like it should be quick and I shouldn't even notice that I'm needing to do it. Versus like, the perspective, the opposite of that would be like, no one like wants to log into their banking system and just like hang out after a rigorous day, right? Like you don't log in and just chill in your online banking system. Like you don't want to. You have no notion for that. So I like this example because you can think as not only as a product team working on the software, but even if you're like someone on the phone or someone in an office actually talking with someone, your mind could always be focused on what is the quickest way to resolve this issue or get this person what they wanted. And that's what I'm going to prioritize because that's what our strategy is, what our principle is when we do that. So try to boil down what you want to do to something as specific as that. I mean, I think Brian, this is a good time for you to kind of go over maybe the opposite of the strategies that you've seen over the years, right? We were talking about the kind of the aspirationally accurate, but sort of also airily vague strategies that we've encountered over the years.
So I think that's what we see far too often is that when a business is setting a strategy, they feel the need to be very clever and very corporate. So a lot of the wording suddenly becomes long and it gets further and further away from customers or from what they really meant. And this is one of the reasons why I love this example is because it's relatable. This doesn't come across as incredibly clever, but when you think about it, it is because, as you said, everyone has a really clear vision of why we're doing what we're doing and what we need to achieve all the way through the design process. An example of the type of strategy I would see instead of this would be, we want to have the world's best banking app. Well, that's great, but how do we get the world's best banking app? How are we measuring that? What makes it good? Are we sure that the best app is actually going to achieve what it is we want? Will that make customers happy if our app has more buttons than everybody else? Or is it about really helping customers live their lives more and spend less time doing banking? So I think with strategy, it's about the spending time really simplifying that down to something that fits. Trying to think of other examples where, and I think many people have been in businesses where this has happened before, a vision is set that's so high level that the opposite would just be farcical. We want to be the world's best. We want to have the world's worst app. That's just not something you'd set. So a strategy has to be something that's unique to your business, that relates to your customers or what it is you're trying to achieve, and is actionable by people in their day-to-day decision making. And I think that's the thing that I enjoy working with businesses, is helping them link people's day-to-day work back to the company goals That sounds really corporate, but it doesn't have to be. I think that we can find a way of all working together in a way that gives us meaning. Because after all, if we are just out there trying to make the world's best banking app, that's a little directionless, right? We all have different opinions about what that might look like. We then have conflict in the business. We then have difficulty in measuring whether we're doing a good job or not. So I think strategy is really important, and linking it back to technology is a great way of engaging people.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a one of many good tests to test out your big organization wide strategy claims is just like put the word not in front of what you just said, and then ask yourself, would this be the strategy for anyone? Or in fact, like, did we just state something that's the strategy for everyone? Like, we would like to be best in class in our industry. Like, if you can just nod it and like, obviously no one would ever want that, then you're not really making a choice, and you need to figure out how to make your strategy more specific and more clear. So the other thing I said it's good to go over is, so if you are going to be using software as kind of like the way you're doing strategy and vice versa, the way your company is running, I think it's good to have a model of the way of doing software that fits best with that, right? Now, speaking of putting not in front of things, right? Like, there is a way of doing software that people will, pejoratively call a waterfall process, right? And that there's certainly places for that where it makes sense. And this process, the opposite of what we have here, is that you specify everything up front on a 6 to 12 to 18-month cycle, and you say the software should have these features. You may even have wireframes, and you give this off to some developers, and they implement exactly that. And of course, there's some back and forth and modification if you discover things that don't work, if you have good developers. But most of the goal is to get exactly what you asked for, which is not always a great result, as we'll get into. But the opposite of that is this more agile, design-driven way that we've done at Pivotal Labs, now Tanzu Labs, for a long time, and many people in the industry do it as well. And this is just a recent example. There's been I think it's dying down now, but there's been an ongoing nerd fight about developer productivity measurements, started by a McKinsey article. And in the write-up, which you can check out there when you can click on the slides, one of the rebuttals, they have a great example of doing software in a good way. They were missing an arrow, I think, which I added in there. But essentially, like, if you're familiar with the scientific method, it's kind of an application of this, where you in your organization, your development team, product managers, maybe even someone in strategy. This is kind of the point that we're trying to get to. They try to come up with you could call it a customer pain point, an opportunity, an issue, and then you theorize some way to solve it. You write the code for it, and then you ship it. Maybe it's good to do design docs before that. It depends, but whatever. And the next stage is, of course, you want to see if your customers are behaving differently. Did it actually fix their problem, right? And we'll get to some good metrics around that. And then if it did fix their problem, then great. You can fix it even better, or you can try to fix it again. But if you go through this cycle every 1 to 4 weeks, and of course, the changes that you have are not the same amount of changes in code you would deliver in 12 months. You figure out how to parcel out a series of small changes that are always going towards that objective. And not only towards that objective, but you can imagine that as you go through this cycle and you're observing how your customers, how people are using your software, you'll discover new things, right? Like, which is the opposite of waterfall stuff, or not the opposite necessarily, but different than that approach, where in month 1, you specified what the problems were, how you were going to solve them, and you wait until you don't actually like validate and discover that. You discover it like 12 months later when you ship the software. So you have a much more, there's a reason it's called agile, a much more agile, adaptive way of going about things. Do you have anything you want to add, Brian?
I was just going to say, I think I'm going to try and avoid ranting on finance, because I think I do that quite a lot when we talk about this why agile. But if we think about everything else in our lives, if I was going to be designing a house, I'd engage with an architect. I mean, wouldn't expect to get everything right first time, even though we know we only get to build the house in production once. but we'll work through with the architect various modeling and experiments, and you might have various different drawings of how all the possibilities before you decide which way you want to go. And I think software is no different in that we need to discover more along the way, because it's foolish to think we'll get everything right in a large, complex, creative exercise all in the one go. And I think businesses in IT particularly largely end up with a waterfall type method because that's the way the business is driven. So finance want to know in advance, 12 months in advance, exactly how you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they'll want to know exactly how much it's going to cost. And I think the subtle change here is we can say what it is we want to do, but we don't need to say how we're going to achieve it. And I think that's the thing with Agile. The goal that you're trying to meet doesn't change, but you get to experiment along the way and drive closer to it over time rather than shooting for it and then maybe missing it by 100 miles.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you're getting at is, well, not the only thing, but one of the things you're getting at is, I think outside of development and maybe even outside of IT, you've been conditioned, rightly so, to like not trust the commitments made by developers, right? Like, because they're often over budget and not delivered on time, and then the functionality isn't always what you expected it to be, right? And this is over decades, right? And so I think the response to that has been that kind of mentality of like, we will have assurance by having even more commitment. Like, let's specify everything way up front and say, this is exactly what you're going to deliver. But the way that software is delivered and done has been changed numerous times. And in fact, what you can now do is you can minimize the risk of what you're doing by following these practices, and you get a much better ability to manage that risk, as you'll see here. And what you see illustrated here is that idea of like building up risk over a long waterfall process. You don't really know until you deliver the software if it's going to do what you wanted, if it's going to be valuable, if you even solve the right problems. Whereas if you're delivering in these smaller 1 to 4 week cycles, what you instead are doing is you're discharging that risk each cycle, right? You still don't know within these cycles if you're doing the right thing, but the risk, your strategic risk, is lessened and you have more control over it, which has all sorts of great effects for finance and for also strategy as a whole, which, I wanted to go over this because it shows you an even more compelling reason, or an additional compelling reason, to think about aligning the way you do strategy with software. So it's easy to kind of think, and we see this a lot at this point. Brian dropped off there, but he's going to be joining back, and then I'll pull him back into our talk here. It's easy to think that what you end up doing if you're doing things on a weekly cycle is just kind of just a bunch of chaos, right? Like, people just kind of are developing stuff and you hope it's right. They're developing it quickly, but is it the right stuff? And that you don't have a lot of control and governance over it. But the opposite is what we were saying, is like, really, you have these very strong commitments that take a long time. You build up this risk over a 6-12 month period, and you kind of hope that what you built is usable. You can kind of see you've got the same problem on either end of the spectrum. You don't have enough validation about if you're doing the right thing. But instead, there's a practice that there's a way of thinking that we've done with our customers a lot at Pivotal Labs, now Tanzu Labs, and that I've seen at many other organizations, and I'm sure Brian has as well, where you actually can do these cycles and you have a very high degree of governance and process that you're following. So now we want to go over one framework of thinking about how you can do strategy in a way that is useful for your software capabilities, for your software teams, and vice versa. Like, when software teams are following this model, it also is useful to bubble up to strategy. Now, there's all sorts of strategy frameworks, from stuff like this to canvases to maps, whatever you can do your classic sort of strategic analysis. And they're all flawed. Some just have better flaws than others. But I think the objectives, goals, strategy, and metrics one, it provides some good output that I think is useful if you're doing a lot of software. So I want to go over the OGSM framework and kind of give an example of how you would fit it into this idea of using software as your main strategic tool, as kind of like the skeleton and the muscle of your business. So first of all, it's composed of 4 parts: an objective, a goal, strategy, and metrics. And the objective is, it's usually kind of like what you would call a strategy, right? Like it's the thing that you want to achieve, right? You could almost call it a goal, but a goal instead is it's the numerical equivalent, some number representative of what your objective would be. And so and I'll give an example of this soon, but then you have your strategy, and there could be multiple ones in each of your little burgers or cakes here, depending on what you enjoy eating. And I think it's in the context of strategy and design. I would think of strategy more as a tactic or an experiment that you're running. But it's OGSM, not OGEM, although OGM would be a fun word to pronounce, so we'll just use strategy. This is an example of, you always have to be careful when you use the word strategy, depending on how overly knowledgeable someone is about strategy lore, because they'll be like, oh, that's not a strategy, and then you're going to waste 20 minutes just recovering from that. And so what you want to do when you have a tactic, a thing that you're going to do to achieve those goals that is kind of a numeric representation of your objective, you again come up with a metric that would tell you if that strategy, that experiment worked. And you can see here, if you remember back to the idea of as I like to call it, the small batch process of software. We come up with a theory of what our users, our customers, what problem they have. We come up with a theory of how we can use software to solve that problem. We code it, we put it in front of them, we observe if it solves their problem or not, and then we go through the cycle again accordingly. You can see that what's built into the OGSM framework are measurements and experiments and that feedback that lets you validate if your goals and objectives are good. So let's go into an example of what that looks like. So this is a pretty basic example that applies to a lot of companies, and I think almost comically we've chosen a bad strategy at the top. Grow market share. Like as Brian was joking earlier, I don't think there's that many companies that would say keep market share level as their goal. Maybe if you're in like a private equity fund and you're looking to just be a kind of a cash cow for the other companies in the stable. Anyways, I'm overthinking it. But this is kind of at a high level, right? That you want to grow the market share. So how would you wrap numbers around that, right? Like, what does that mean? And so you could say, this is an example from a little while ago. Like, you could say in 2 years from now, we want to have $50 million in sales, right? So how are we going to achieve that? What strategy will we use, or tactic, or experiment? And I'm going to say experiment. The experiment that we think is like, well, instead of growing, if we want market share, instead of growing our revenue by saving money or by increasing deal size, right? Instead, what we want to do is have more transactions. So we want to, we might, if you had like 10 transactions and you wanted to make more money, you could just raise the price by $5 or sell people more stuff. But if you want to increase more transactions, it's like, no, we should have 20 different sales that we do instead of just 10. And the way we're going to measure that is just the revenue we get from sales. Now, this is very high level, right? But you can kind of see that it's kind of what you would have at the top, and it's still specific enough to be useful. So then let's go down another level, and we see that as that's passed down. So you can see here that the way the OGSM stuff works is that your strategy becomes the next level's objective, right? How they're going to implement that. I'm moving my cursor around to point this out, but no one can see it. But so you can see then at the next level, their goal is to increase transaction volume. which going all the way down, and then they have a more tangible goal for the near term future, right? This should result in 30 million sales, which if you can do math, that means in the next year they should do 20 million or something like that. But their theory, their strategy is that it's too hard for people to buy stuff from us. So we should make it easier for them to buy stuff with us, to transact. And the way we'll measure that is that our conversion rate, when someone wants to buy something for us, or we get their attention, that they actually switch. That's the way we're gonna measure that. And then again, you go down to the lowest level, and by lowest, I don't mean that in a judgmental way. You go to the level where things actually happen instead of people just managing. And you see, again, what was the strategy becomes the objective, and the goal is in the next 3 months. See, the timeline also shortens. We want to increase conversion by 10%. So we'll have been selling more things. We'll have more transactions. And our theory about what's going on is that the checkout flow that we have in the software is too long. This is kind of like the motorcycle insurance example, right? Like it's taking too long for people to figure out if they can get the insurance. And the way we'll measure that is, well, people don't buy things and they abandon a shopping cart. And so we'll measure that. Like the less abandoned shopping carts we have, that means the more efficient the process will be. So what you can see here and there's lots of documentation about OGSM and things like that, but you can see that this is a model, a framework that you can use to have at each level, more or less, here's another word for you, actionable sort of strategy that you can use, particularly in the software world. So, you can, just to kind of summarize things up, right? Like you can see how the strategy becomes the objective. It kind of decomposes into various layers, and then just before Brian kind of gives his experience with OGSM and this kind of stuff, like I think there's a few things I wanted to point out that are also important, which is also in this framework, and this is something that like is not in a lot of overviews of it, but something that we focus a lot at Pivotal Labs, now Tanzu Labs, is it's very important to have like a person responsible for each of those burgers, right? Like you want to identify who is the owner, who's responsible for it. Like in Amazon lore, they call that a single-threaded leader. I forget if they still do that. So you always need to go check in on Amazon lore and see if they still do it. Like I learned recently, they don't really do 2 pizza teams anymore. They do the single thread leader. So if you've just allocated budget for ordering a bunch of pizzas, you should go maybe back that out and look at single threaded leader instead. And then the other kind of mindset is each level is delegating how you achieve those objectives to below there. And again, the other thing to keep in mind is that like there should be feedback going up and down this layer, right? Like as each layer discovers something, particularly the layer, again, not in a judgmental way, spatially, at the bottom, as they make discoveries of how they're actually doing things, you want that to go up and kind of be reflected in the way that people are forming the other layers, the other burgers on the chart there. But what's been your experience in like using or talking about things like OGSM with people, Brian?
So I think first and foremost, I think many people think OGSM at face value is too simple or common sense. But when it comes to setting strategy and trying to define the working culture in an organization, I find that often it's the common sense things that are perhaps most useful. So in practice, what I've found is, first of all, if we look at this picture, one objective at the top can result in a lot of work in the lower sections. And I think that's really important to highlight at the corporate level, because we can have sometimes too many priorities. And I'm sure there'll be more than one listener who has probably experience of this, but my favorite so far was an organization I was working with who were very keen to show me their big 5 projects, their big 5 strategic programs that are a must do for this year. The only problem is there was 7 on the list.
Right.
And this is part of the issue. I think that at the corporate level, it's really good to really hone in on what it is that's important to us and understand that when we set one of those priorities, it has a knock-on effect for everyone else in the business. I think the second is linking what's happening in a boardroom somewhere, all the way through, single thread, I suppose, right down to someone who's making an actual change in a line of code. It does a couple of things. I think the most important thing, though, is that it means that the engineer doing some work knows why they're doing that piece of work and
Yeah.
perhaps not something else. And for engineers, I'm not going to say everyone's the same, but engineers seem to have a certain mindset in that they cannot follow orders blindly. They have to understand the reasoning, the thought process behind it. And I think OGSM is a really great way of demonstrating how this idea has started off at the board level, come down through the business level, down through programs and projects, all the way down to individual engineers' day-to-day lives. That does a number of things. That improves people's understanding of the business. It improves their decision making, because if this isn't the best way of achieving that goal, then perhaps they've got a better idea. But most importantly, I think it gives people meaning. It gives them this ability to know that they played a part in this big high level objective. So come the end of the year, when sales are 50 million higher, they know they played a part in that.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there, that one of the frustrations I have frequently had in both sort of like trickling down strategy and then also consuming the little drops of water that reach me if I'm down at the bottom, and that is, in both directions, there's almost this ability with middling strategy to advocate responsibility for success, right? Like at the top, you can just sort of like, if you overly delegate and keep things vague, you can just be like, well, they didn't understand what we said and they didn't implement it correctly, right? And they didn't spend the time to understand this and really explore. But if you're at the bottom, you can equally say like, this is very vague and I didn't understand what was going on, right? So, when you have this kind of layering, that's one of the things that you want to achieve is, flattening is too strong of a word because that's very aspirational, that will flatten things. And who gets squished when things get flattened are the people in the middle, and they're people. I've been the people in the middle. I don't want to be flattened. I just want to do a good job. And so, you need to set up these channels, these ways of communicating up and down and getting that feedback loop going, which I think, again, this goes to my joke of like, all strategy models are flawed. Some just have better flaws than others. Is like, whatever model you're using, like, figure out a way to establish those channels and then actually do it, right? Instead of, there's a craze of OKRs a couple of years ago. And, I've talked with many people and experienced this as well. Is like, you can fill out an OKR template, but you can make it just as bad as an MBO or a SBR or a whatever you want to call it, whatever the the management thing is. It's important to actually follow and understand what the practices are. Now, to that end of kind of like communication up and down the stack, but also being able to quickly respond to what you're learning in software. One of the practices that we've used at Pivotal Labs, now Tanzu Labs, over the years is putting in place these growth boards. And what these growth boards are, and you can see it, if you look at kind of like the stack of burgers there, the strategy burgers, that you tend to have a growth board at each level kind of owning a burger, right? And this is the group that's kind of like a governance, managerial, almost ownership group that is, I think you generally do it when you figured it out on a quarterly basis. Maybe when you're learning this, you want to do it on a monthly basis to kind of be able to respond quickly and learn quickly. But I would look at this group almost as the board or the investors of what's happening in that burger. And you report to them on, a monthly or a quarterly basis. And you want to have someone from finance there, someone from the business, but then also technical representation and product representation. And so this group has the responsibility and the authority and the know-how to really look at what's happening with the burger there and kind of decide, should we keep doing things? Should we fund this more? If you're practicing gated funding, do we bring more funding in? But again, as Brian was saying, it's a commonsensical thing to be doing, but as I would suggest, so you should actually do it, right? And there you can, again, you can't click on it now, but if you get the slides, you can click on Amy there has written up a great overview of what a growth board looks like, but it's a way of governing those processes. So then finally, what Brian and I wanted to go over is, so I think we've talked a lot about how strategy people should change and how management should change, which is great. We should always be doing that. Tell those capitalists how to do their job. But I think it's also equally important for the staff to change, right? There's a lot of change in how staff work, how they think, how they organize. And so we wanted to review that at the application developer layer, but also very importantly at the infrastructure layer. Like if you remember the first episode, we explained why changing the way you do your infrastructure to a cloud native way, to a platform driven way is necessary, is required if you want to do software in this way. So what is this way of doing software? Well, here's a summary, again, of how we do it at VMware Tanzu Labs, formerly Pivotal Labs. And that is, we actually have a pretty rigorous, very well documented, also proven over several decades set of practices that we follow. So we follow user-centric design, right? So a lot of what we talked about, both in a strategy sense and in the software sense, has to do with, if you remember from the insurance, motorcycle insurance example, the commercial kitchen example, and the telco example with Liberty Mutual, the unnamed place, and Orange, they're very people-centric, right? Like in that commercial-centric example, they actually woke up at I assume 3:30 in the morning to be at the kitchen at 4 a.m., and they were very user-centric and observing what people are doing, discovering things, interviewing people, coming up with designs and prototypes and experimenting with it. Now, that's a whole discipline and a process. And the optimal way of doing software the way we do it, there's actually a designer on each product team. And now the next level is doing product management, which is really thinking about not only not just that kind of design way, but thinking about what is the business process working here? What do we as the business, what do we want what do we need to happen? What does our customer need to happen? You're really trying to invent the best way of executing the business and driving what features are in there. And then, of course, there's the programming. You still have to write code, despite what all the AI stuff would kind of make you freak out about. And we follow basically an evolved version of extreme programming, which was released in 1989, if I remember the time that book went out. I remember speaking of canteens, I remember being in a canteen, and I had a copy of that book reading through it. It's very exciting. But there's a lot of very disciplined, rigorous processes that you follow when you do extreme programming that all geared around this fast cycle, paying attention to users, right? All these things fit together. And then there's also, for large organizations, this part doesn't get talked about much when you hear the Swedish music company and the big American advertising tech companies talk. But there's a lot of enterprise architecture that goes into it. Thinking about how you work with your existing applications, how you deal with the fact that you're running probably thousands of different applications over tens of thousands of developers, how you get them to coordinate. That's a whole different way of operating you even use a word like application estate than it is if you're one of these younger companies in the tech world. So it's pretty easy to look up these practices if you're interested. And of course, we're always interested in explaining them more with you. So at the infrastructure layer, so Brian, tell us how the infrastructure layer, how things change around there.
So I'll just say, first of all, I think the interesting thing about the previous slide is that all of those things are human related, which is lovely to see, because I think that's the big change really that's happened in IT, is we need to move a little bit further away from the technology and instead think about how it affects people, be that end users, those involved in design, that being more product led, all the way through to how we actually build it and orchestrate the behaviors that we want to try and see. And that fundamentally for me is what we're trying to achieve in infrastructure now. We are looking to change the way that people interact with infrastructure teams. So in the past, what we've probably seen is this kind of project mindset or a project way of doing things where there's been decisions made somewhere in the business that we're going to do this big thing. We're going to spend lots of money and invest heavily in this blob. There'll be a whole bunch of design, and then eventually IT will be engaged to build out some infrastructure for it. Unfortunately, a few things generally happen. Number one is the project's already running late by this point. And that means that when the infrastructure people say, we think there's better ways of working or better ways of doing this, there's no time left to really think about what we're going to change. And if we think back to the original part when we're talking about agility, for me, it's not necessarily working faster. It's about getting results more often, which allows us to change our course more readily through the journey. So that's the step number one, is we want to be part of this earlier on in the process so we can influence the output. The other thing we generally see is the way of working itself. Like in an infrastructure team, normally it's all driven by tickets, which is a horrible way for humans to work, for everyone involved. No one enjoys raising tickets, and not many people are going to enjoy answering them because it's incredibly transactional. There's not enough context there. Also, in the last episode, we talked about the delays that come with tickets. If we send to one team, we could expect maybe 24, 48 hours or more wait time between those things, which really affects our efficiency, which slows us down being able to do things. In a platform mindset, we want to be different. We want to be offering something that adds value to project teams that they're able to consume. That means that we've built it in advance. Big change there being, that means that we can be involved in projects earlier in that process because they already know what we're capable of doing and what we have available on the truck, so to speak, what we're selling. And if they don't see what they need, they can work with us really early on in the process. Likewise, if we have this product, this standard thing that we're doing time and time again, well, we're not building a bespoke infrastructure from scratch. We're able to automate, we're able to use more enterprise, patterns, we're able to standardize what we do so we can do it faster, more consistently. And again, it's really interesting. I often find the benefit of automation is not always the speed, it's the consistency. And I learned that lesson when I was automating VM deployments. We wanted to make developers more effective by giving them VMs faster. But that's not what changed culture. The thing that changed culture was the ability to destroy those same VMs using an automated process. So I charted two metrics. One was how many VMs we built, but the other was how many VMs we destroyed. And it's the second metric that told us about a change in culture, moving from tidying up test environments to just building whole new ones from scratch, being more agile in the way that we worked. So from an infrastructure team, I think it's about adopting a product mindset. It's about thinking about the users that are working with us as our customers and then acting appropriately around that. And that's how we interface when they first want to work with us. That's how we go about organizing what we do. Again, we're not going to be service-based. We've got a bunch of capabilities we bring to every project, but instead we use our capabilities to build a product they consume. And all the way through, we're able then to support them in a much more company type way. Like my only big hint I give to everybody is that if you want to try and achieve this, think of your team as its own company. So you need to do your own marketing research. You need to do your own customer support. You need to think about what it is value-wise that you're giving back to the company.
Yeah, just as a little footnote, your distinction between, or your nuance between speed and consistency, like there's I don't know, this comes up every now and then, but that one of the interesting thought innovations of Scrum back in the 2000s, which was kind of like the large organization, the multi-team version of XP. That's a terrible way of putting it, but whatever. Was that I think they advocated for a monthly delivery cadence. But what became important was building up trust that you could consistently deliver something every month, right? And then over time, calibrating on how much you could deliver every month. This would be called velocity. And I think it definitely is possible to get mixed up with just like speed and orfebrancy of delivery versus reliability and consistency, which is in most large organizations, you just want to be able to make plans, as in life, right? Like you want to know and kind of trust that something that's is going to happen next week is actually going to happen. And that's a good effect of a lot of the other practices we've talked about here, is building up organizational trust that people can deliver. But what comes with that, and this is hard for, I think, people outside of agile software and kind of people in strategy to contend with, is I can guarantee I can start to build up trust that I will deliver something. What I deliver is very hard to make commitments about, but at least it will be validated that what we deliver is something that was useful to be done. Well, speaking of delivering things that are useful, at the end here, we've mentioned Pivotal Labs, now called Tanzu Labs, quite a bit, and that is definitely something that we do a lot at here in VMware Tanzu. And I think you can get a sense of why that methodology is important, but why it is a technology itself that is equally important to the other things that we do here. And we covered this more in the first episode as well, but I think that the other things you see on here, a platform, and again, these are things that we in VMware Tanzu we work on and we provide with our customers or partners, if you enjoy another businessy word. I guess you have literal partners that you go to business with, but then you can think of your customers as partners in what you're doing. But we have several platforms that free up developer time, but also, as Brian was just saying, your operations infrastructure people's time to be able to do all of this stuff, right? Waking up at 3:30 a.m. in the morning and going to a kitchen at 4 a.m. requires that you not be worrying about YAML and all of that stuff, to use the joke of the day. Not only for your developers, but your infrastructure people, right? They want to focus on delivering what developers need to do that. So we have the Tanzu Application Service, which is based on the open source Cloud Foundry. And this is a very, in a good way, tightly integrated, as people used to say, opinionated stack of the container-based infrastructure that you run, all the middleware services integrated into there, all the way up to the developer tools and interfaces that are used to deploy their applications. And deploy is even kind of a strong word if you know the CF push way of putting it, but to cause their applications to be deployed, to use the passive voice specifically. And very recently, we also integrated in Backstage to really go up the stack to make it a full platform that integrates very closely with what developers are doing, kind of how they collaborate with each other. Now, if you're more of a Kubernetes purist, which is great for you, we also have the Tanzu Application Platform, which does the same thing in slightly different ways for Kubernetes, right? So what you find with Kubernetes, if you've ever gotten it installed, is that it just gives you a blinking cursor. It's a very fine, functional, great blinking cursor. But if you just give that over to your application developers, they're not going to have time to study how people are buying motorcycle insurance, because they're going to be spending a lot of their time layering on top all the stuff you need for Kubernetes. By design, it being a platform for building needed platforms for them to actually do their application. So the Tanzu Application Platform will do that for you. And we've already talked about Tanzu Labs quite a bit. That's something that you can actually get a very good sense of how we do work with people. We've got a lot of stuff practiced there. Now, also, if you're just starting out with running Kubernetes and you want to do that on your own, we have Tanzu for Kubernetes Operations, which can help you kind of get over that hump, that hurdle of managing Kubernetes. And equally importantly, for large organizations, it will help you manage multiple types of Kubernetes across different clouds, your edges, your private data centers, and also regions, right? This is another thing that most large organizations have to deal with or get to deal with, is running in multiple sovereignties or countries. And so you've got a very multi-cloud way of doing things. And Tanzu Kubernetes for Operations will help you out with that. So if you're doing anything related to what we're saying, you probably would be very interested in one of these four things. And we'd be happy to talk about you, but also talk with you more. Now, speaking of, before we wrap up, if you're interested in hearing more, you can get a free hour of consultation from our labs group about all of this type of stuff. If you can just go fill out this form. You can click on that QR code or click on the attachment there, or you can go to tanzu.vmware.com/labs, scroll to the bottom of the page, fill out this form. and someone should contact you about talking with you more to kind of like go over how we might be able to help you, kind of sort things out. And with that, we've had so much fun talking that we don't really have time for questions. So I apologize for that. We want to wrap up here. But if you're interested, definitely if you have questions, you should go to this form and you can send in your questions and hopefully get answers to them and hopefully get started on really figuring out how to use strategy and software together to get your organization running better and better. So thanks for doing this with me, Brian. It was fun.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thanks everyone for listening. And sorry we didn't get to your questions, but also if you can find us, which is pretty easy to do, perhaps you could ask us those questions directly, and we'll answer them. So tune in on If I Was Super Clever, I Would Know This Date by Heart. And as I am talking here, I am stumbling through looking it up. If you want to see the third episode in our series here, that would be S1 E3. It's going to be on October 24th. And you can also watch that free. You should register for it if you haven't already. And we're going to be talking about perhaps one of the most interesting, difficult things, which is people don't like changing. So how can you help people go through change and change the way they're doing things? Not only those individual contributors, but also those managers who I guarantee you, they also don't like changing. Or they don't seem to act like it sometimes. So in the meantime, enjoy thinking about this stuff. Bye-bye.